Most of you know that I'm Tracy Bruce, and I'm the rector here at St. John's Church. And we're delighted to have you here with us this evening for a wonderful event. So, first of all, Jonathan came to our attention actually through a parishioner who at the time I think was a vestry person, Will Cook. And we were beginning to look at our history, and so we met with Jonathan briefly and then worked out his schedule for him to come and join us. He joined us last July, and we got started right away in terms of this history project in looking at our cemetery, and a lot of us got involved in actually cleaning cemetery stones. Well, as his work continued, now it is 9 months later, and we have been blessed to have him with us, and he's still nearly every day uncovering something that is really wonderful and new. Some piece of our history that, we didn't understand or we didn't know. Particularly, we had a whole set of our church records that nobody had seen since 1940. And so, indeed, in his research, down at what used to be the Maryland Historical Society, I think it's called something else now, but anyway, Maryland Center for Maryland History, thank you, or culture, or whatever. Anyway, lo and behold, a missing microfiche with all of our records that have been missing he found. So that was just one of many discoveries. We have been blessed to have him with us here on this journey. We're blessed to have you all here with us as well. So and he has a long resume. I mean, he's a lawyer and a historic preservationist, wrote the quintessential book on all the historic restoration in Charleston, South Carolina. I could go on and on. But most of all, he's been a really good friend and the most wonderful, almost like private eye, trying to help us learn more about who we are. So, without further ado, Jonathan Poston.
Well, it's such a pleasure to be at this really pivotal point in this lengthy study, which started out maybe 4 or 5 months, and 6 months, and 7 months. But it's been a pleasure being the sleuth in this effort to investigate the history of St. John's Western Run, which deserves a lot more fame or attention than it has received for its history, and for the very many unique aspects of its development, of its past parishioners and rectors, and the way it has approached its faith missions over the many years. So it was a former rector of St. John's that wrote as the church was nearing its completion. That is the new church rebuilt after the fire of 1867, and said the gilded cross on the spire will cast its shadow in a valley of surpassing loveliness, and the edifice will be an enduring witness of what a small but determined band of church people can accomplish. And that was really the case then, is the case with many churches today, that it took a very small group and a lot of hard work at raising money to try to rebuild St. John's after this tragic fire in 1867 that almost ended it completely. But more on that in a moment. This project began, as Tracy alluded, with a meeting with Will Cook and Tracy and myself that occurred in September of 2020. And we began to formulate an approach to an overall preservation study of the buildings here at St. John's Western Run, as well as a way of relooking at the history of St. John's. So it is really described as a documentary research and development of a historic preservation plan for the church, for the churchyard, the rectory, and the landscape. And that seemed to be the primary part of the study and of the results of the study at the beginning. But what's happened is that the history itself and a rediscovery of a sort of new chronology for St. John's Western Run has really taken over. I should say that at the outset, one of the challenging things about researching St. John's Western Run, and I would like to recognize Mary Klein, who's with us today, who's the archivist of the Diocese of Maryland. And Mary knew this was one of the pitfalls of researching St. John's, because it's called different things at different times and in different records. So it's either St. John's Glendon, or St. John's Butler Road, or St. John's Western Run, or it has all these different appellations. And it was really a rector I'll mention in a minute who decreed in the 1840s, it shall be called St. John's Western Run. And the parish does follow that today, but if you ask the post office or if you try to look it up in so many sources, as many of you know, this doesn't work that easily. Well, the rectory was a gift. It's the oldest building left on the site, and completed in 1842. It was a gift of John Johns, who had power and influence and money, but seems to have been very devoted to his church. Some of his siblings and other relations had maybe even as much or more money than he, but he was a bachelor. He was very interested in the church. Died in 1850, at the end of 1857, and left some substantial money, but had really made this gift that continues today of the rectory itself. And we don't know who built it. And one of the first things we started out with was trying to figure out who were the builders of the initial buildings at St. John's. Were they African Americans, or and enslaved people, or free people, or were they craftsmen from elsewhere? We just really could not find that information. But we could find Mr. John's gift and the detail of it. He built it on the church's property, but then about 2 years after the completion of the structure, he formally deeded it to the church, and it's very much recorded at that time. The rectory also has a stable, which has been very little studied, even though we think of it as a garage, and it has this sort of ubiquitous 1940s pull-up garage door. But if you look to the side of it, you see the original stable doors. And it was very important because the rectors of St. John's had to have a means of getting about the parish. But many of them were not paid enough to even have a horse. And it was a big question with each new rector as to whether they would be given a horse. And several of them were, some of them weren't. So the ones who were not given a horse, I don't know. There's nothing in the records that say what happened. They don't want to walk, I guess. But we started with the idea of the rectory. And the rectory has so much history. And I'm not going to spend much time on it because it's still part of our study, but the rectory kitchen has a lot of history. You go in it today and you see very nice cabinetry and very nice appliances, but it has its original cooking hearth fireplace, and the church had a lot of events there in the 19th century trying to raise money. In the 1870s and 80s, they had an annual oyster supper in the kitchen of the rectory. And because there was no parish house, very often the parlors of the rectory were used for weddings, for christenings, and for all sorts of events and meetings. So the rectory is very important on a level not just as a residential structure, but as very tied up with the whole history of the parish. Well, the churchyard has all these wonderful monuments and tombstones and gravestones. It's a great mix, but it's also a very restrained cemetery. And the reason for that is that from the very early years, the church decided to put all kinds of restrictions on gravestones. And they didn't want as many large monuments. They did not want mausoleums or burial vaults. And they were very restrictive, even among the leading families of the parish, on what could be erected in the churchyard, which is what makes it so great today. So now we have these documents that go with the cemetery. We have a great map that you see in the lower part of that slide, and another drawn map that has all the gravestones on it. And we began with that as our pivotal document, our ultimate document that the group that we assembled could come and record gravestones starting last summer. So this is our group, and we worked through pretty much the entire old cemetery, and were able to measure the stones to record their conditions and their types and their names and their dates, etc. And all that information is we're still digitizing that, but it will be a great resource not only for scholars, but it will be a great resource for, in the future, taking and tracking future conservation of the stones. So, anyway, so this is some of our cleanup. Some of you will recognize Paisley. Paisley, are you here today? Yeah. Tonight, I know you are. There you are. Paisley Isaacs. Sometimes when I hit that, your voice comes through as you're cleaning that stone, because it was amazing to use this D2 solution. And it turned out that through John Schilling, the church had a lot of it already in store, and it does a remarkable job in cleaning gravestones. And it's, from a conservation standpoint, it's still considered the best of anything that can be used to clean a gravestone.
Favorite. Look at that.
There we go.
Sacred.
Look at that. I was going to change that, but I really like Casey saying, look at that. So, because that really was sort of the story of that very large John stone, which is one of the most beautiful in the cemetery, Greek column monument, and it really deserved the cleaning that it received. And in the process, we discovered a lot about individuals in the cemetery that weren't, people that weren't even really known in the parish. Somebody that was really well known was William Page Dane, who was rector in the 1930s, came when the church was still trying to come back up, and was a very beloved rector, only rector less than 2 years, and died on the job, and the church paid for his tombstone, which you see, and that's on the left. And then there were these three crosses, a couple in the middle, and then a gentleman on the right, on the far right, William Adams McClinton. And Tracy and I were out there one day, and it said priest, and I went to Mary Klein at the archives, and I said, have you ever heard of William Adams McClinton? She said, of course, because he was a very prominent priest here in Baltimore, rector of Mount Calvary Church. He founded a school called the Donaldson School. He was also sort of had a group of curates and priests who worked under him with various small churches in that part of Baltimore. And there's a lot of little Episcopal churches if you go there today. So William McClinton, and we're not entirely sure why, except that he received a gift of a plot here, and he was buried. So anyway, I wanted to just sort of in a nutshell at the beginning tell you what the major findings of the study are, and I think you'll see as we go through what those major findings are illustrated throughout. The church has had impacts infinitely beyond its size and rural location, and that's the case that you'll see throughout. Most rectors of the mid to late 19th century ministered significantly to African American people in the area and the larger rural community. They didn't just limit themselves to the parish members or to the wealthy families of the Worthington Valley. They were very widespread in their outreach. The church was nearing redundancy, and I think it's okay to say that. Thomas, can I use that word, redundancy? Until the Green Spring Hounds moved to Stamford in 1925. and with the purchase of farms by persons from outside the valley for raising horses and the growth of related sporting activities, St. John's began to grow and thrive. And there's lots of history to that that I won't be able to cover, but that deserves a lot more study and also more writings on it. In the 20th century, despite the special emphasis of sporting, the church went far beyond its building area with major outreach to the less fortunate. And that manifests itself to some of the institutions in the area like Rosewood and to many of the other area, other facilities in the area, as well as eventually to Paul's Place. So again, we're in this area. This is a wonderful 1857 map, and it really lists some estates by the name that we know them today, and it also lists names. And if you look at the area, St. John's is kind of in the middle, sort of to the right, upper part of that slide in the red. There's Worthington and Worthington and Worthington and Johnson and Gill and sort of the whole just a group of people that are largely come with 4 or 5 different surnames. And that was the character of the valley in this period, that it was very much a valley of a small interrelated group of people. And so that's the way you have to think about the build-up of St. John's at the beginning and what the parish really was most focused on, which was its local community, and the fact that there weren't a whole lot of families beyond the 4 or 5 that were the founders. Well, the parish, of course, grows out of the parish up the road, St. Thomas, which is a much earlier building and site. And it was the gift from Charles Walker, a large farmer, of 2 acres of his Woodburn farm in 1618 that enabled the building of St. John's. Of course, today we know what we know about Woodburn, if you know this area, is the octagonal house, which if you just turn down Piney Grove Road, is right there on your right, and it's painted yellow. It's a beautiful example of an 1840s house of an octagonal shape. And these octagonal houses were very much in vogue in the period of the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. There's a lot of them actually through the country, but they still, to us today, they arrest our eye with a very different look in this polygonal shape. And there were all sorts of treatises written about them that they could be helpful, that there were ways that they could make you a better person, an octagonal house, having a tiny little staircase that you had to crawl up, and all sorts of things that go along with having an octagonal house. But anyway, Woodburn itself was not the octagonal house. That was built for some women in the family in the 19th century. I guess they thought they needed to be healthier. But the main Woodburn house was a large house. If you see in that lower slide, there's sort of an empty field, and that field is right between us here and the octagonal Woodburn house. So the first rector of St. John's we shared with St. Thomas, the Reverend Charles Poston, and he served for quite a while. He only came to the church every other Sunday, and not always. There was always there were exceptions to that. But the construction of the first church was in 1818, and it was pursuant to a lottery. That was a new thing for me as a historian to realize that Maryland built a lot of churches through lotteries. In fact, the cathedral, the basilica, in downtown Baltimore, Montrose Cathedral for the Roman Catholic Diocese, the Roman Catholic Church, was built through a lottery. So lotteries were pretty common, and the lottery of 1816, which was passed by the Maryland Assembly, enabled the lottery to raise money to build St. John's. There were also subscribers to the construction, but those subscribers' funds were just a part of the total bill. Well, Richard Cromwell is the carpenter. Cromwell is a common name in this area. He was a farmer. He lived near here. And he was on the vestry after the construction. That didn't always happen. There were vestrymen who were involved in construction over the years here. You know, today we sort of think about conflicts of interest, and people doing work for the church if they're involved. But anyway, that was, Cromwell was not on the vestry until after he had worked on the building. But the documents show he was a slave owner. We just don't know for certain if enslaved people were incorporated in his construction here. The stonecutter was a man named George Ring, and it took a lot to find anything out about George Ring, and I still don't know a great deal, except he was an immigrant from German province who came to Baltimore. And as I had said, John Johns had no enslaved people himself. The records show he was not a slaveholder, but his family was. And his relatives, the Worthingtons, were large slaveholders as well. Well, there is a important object that's part of the original foundation of the church. Edward Philpott, who was a prominent parishioner for many years, donated the Pulpit Bible, as it was sometimes referred to. It was for the desk or the lectern, and it's still here. And the church was, the cornerstone was laid, and the church was consecrated by the Right Reverend Richard Kemp, who was the second bishop of Reverend James Kemp, the second Episcopal bishop of Maryland. And these bishops, which Mary showed me in the archives, all kept diaries, and it's right in there that he had come here for the consecration of the church. Well, it's hard to say what the first St. John's Church looked like. We only know a description of the church that was from written in the 1840s by Mr. Philpott, but he said that it seated 300 people. Well, that is a great deal bigger than St. John's Western Rome today. He said it also had accommodation for enslaved people, which usually means galleries or balconies, and that was pretty much all he said. He didn't give us a whole lot of other information, and we can only surmise that it could have been something like All Saints Sunderland, which is in the middle, which isn't too far from us to the south. But that's an earlier church. It's from the 1770s. But it has a sort of auditorium, kind of almost a meeting house style about the main room. But it also, this church from the beginning had an attached vestry room for vestry meetings and an attached schoolroom. And that's true of All Hallows, which you can see on the right, the left slide, and that's the vestry room with the chimney on the left, which is the wing of All Hallows Church. And as I was mentioning, Mary Klein's here, and this is the archives of the Episcopal Diocese of Maryland. It's a wonderful institution, and it's in the Cathedral of the Incarnation's sort of parish hall in the basement. And there's a lot of records in a very small area. Is that fair to say, Mary? Yes. And a great deal of work there, and scholars come there. This is a graduate student from Yale in this picture with Mary, who was there for quite a number of months working on his dissertation. So it holds a lot of very important documents. Well, we have two main documents for our study here. And the first document was well known. And it is the original vestry minute book from 1820 up to the 1890s. And it's on the left. Somebody put a nice ink stain on the front of it about 1870 or something, because it seems to be that type of ink. But it's been restored. It's been conserved very well, really, and well preserved. But it has also been transcribed, although the transcription occasionally needs some tweaking. On the right is the front page from this parish register. And this is a sort of long, torturous story in itself that I won't go into, but basically St. John's had a parish register, or maybe a couple of parish registers from the 19th century that started being kept kind of late, actually, in the 1840s by the then rector at that time, and then were kept by the subsequent rectors. But in 1906, the Maryland Historical Society, what is now called something else, the Maryland keep saying that. Apologies to board members of the Center for Maryland History who might be here. But anyway, the Maryland Historical Society began to copy all the registers of the parishes and some other non-episcopal churches as well. And they had a very large project, and they copied ours, or St. John's, in 1906. And but we don't know where that is. No one has seen it in many, many years. But luckily, in 1940, it was microfilmed. That was a very early sort of venture in microfilming by the Federal Records Project, which was part of the WPA. And so, thankfully, that microfilm survives and tells us a great deal. So, a lot of the activities of St. John's in its early years, particularly in the 1830s and 1840s, are centered on this church and another parish which we cooperated with at that point, Sherwood Church, which many of you know. That church is on York Road, a very, very well-preserved Gothic revival building, and has a really marvelous cemetery too. And it has a great stone rectory, like this church does as well. Their rectory was turned many years ago into a parish house, but it still survives there. Well, we had a couple of other rectors that were shared at that point. John Robinson and George Worthington. George Worthington gave away everything he owned. He was buried in a pauper's grave in Boston. He was constantly giving whatever money he had away. And that was not entirely uncharacteristic of some of the early rectors here. The Reverend William Nelson Pendleton was not like that. He was a rather strong fellow who actually had a fist fight in Reisterstown. Things that he did. But he also ended up being one of the first administrators of Episcopal High School, and eventually was in Lexington and became minister of the Episcopal Church there in Lexington, Virginia, which is where he served out most of his career. He was only here 2 years, and he did live in the rectory with his family, and was quite a colorful individual. As I mentioned, Everett Philpott was a great leader of the church. His family were originally associated with St. Thomas, and their family plot is at St. Thomas. They were not actually buried here, even after they sort of were more involved with St. John's. But of course, their estate, Stanford, is still extant, and is very much intertwined with the history of this church. The Reverend Ethan Allen, don't confuse that with furniture, was rector from 1848 to 1855, and he was the first historian of the Episcopal Church in Maryland. He put together this book you see, Clergy in Maryland. He put together some other histories of the early church. And while he was rector here, he was the one who started, as I said, keeping a parish register because he knew that was important. And I think there were sort of notes around that he had to incorporate into his first register here. But he was here for a good 7 or 8 years. It was during his time that St. John's had a great deal of outreach with the African American community. They particularly were involved in the rectors in baptizing slaves, enslaved people, particularly enslaved children. There were epidemics, whooping cough and smallpox, and there were extracts that you can take from the parish register, very tragic ones, of the death of sometimes multiple enslaved children. For example, one night the rector had to go to the Worthington house Montmorency, which you see here in the lower slide, which is just down the road, and baptized, I think, 5 enslaved children who were ill, and 4 died that night. So there was a great deal of trouble that the rectors had to deal with in terms of the institution of slavery, in terms of disease, and their duties were 24-hour, that's for sure, in this period, even in this rural area. Well, there's a substantial bit of history that had been kind of lost to St. John's. Most people have told me they've not ever heard of this chapel, but this is Montrose Chapel on the left, and it's part of an estate that was given by the merchant, Mr. Patterson, to his grandson, who was the son of Jerome Bonaparte. And Montrose House is still standing. It's up there in the upper right. And in the 1840s, the Montrose property was acquired by Franklin Anderson, who was a Baltimore attorney who'd made quite a bit of money. And he had he was very religious, and he had a deeply religious wife, Elizabeth. And so they decided to build a private chapel on the estate. And they proceeded to do so around the 1850s. And it's still extant today. I'll tell you more about that in a moment. But Montrose Chapel is Greek Revival in style. And if you look in the slide to the right, that's the vault tomb of the Andersons. They're buried in the yard of their chapel. Well, Montrose Chapel intertwines through the history of St. John's a number of ways through the 19th and even in the 20th century, because the church used it as a sort of secondary or chapel of ease almost for the Woodensburg area, that part of the county, and where it's located. And through the 1850s, 60s, 70s, there were ministers there that sometimes Mrs. Anderson would hire a personal clergyman, sort of her own personal confessor, and they would have services there, but sometimes the priests here at St. John's. And particularly after the fire of 1867, it became a church for St. John's and the Western Run Parish that was pretty much used every Sunday. Well, there was a great bit of controversy about it at the beginning, because Bishop Whittingham received a letter from Franklin Anderson offering it as a gift to the diocese, and he was adamant that he did not want to see private chapels on estates in Maryland, so he wrote a fairly strident letter back that said it could become a popish something, or what was it, Mary, or a fun, like a Anabaptist meeting house or something. He was worried it would just become something else, and not under the control of the diocese, and that it wasn't the property of the diocese or one of its parish churches. So he was very opposed to it. And it was very disappointing for the Andersons, and it was sort of disappointing for this church because this church was supporting it from the beginning as a possible secondary parish chapel base or site. And what's interesting is that they just defied Bishop Winningham, and they had services there. Anyway, it was very active through the 1850s and 60s and 70s. And Bishop Winningham had an assistant or adjutant bishop, Bishop Pinckney. He later was Bishop Pinckney. And Pinckney took the absolute opposite view. And Mary, he always did that, didn't he? So he thought that it would be great for the area. He just wrote enthusiastically about it. He went there several times and so highly supported it being a full-blown church. So it was very much in cooperation with this parish for much of its 19th century history. Mrs. Anderson died in the 1880s, and although there were restrictions left in her will and that of her husband, her heirs inherited, it was a family named Sterling. They did not see that they wanted people coming onto their property to use this chapel, but they lost the property a few years later anyway. So eventually, St. John started using it again at times, and then in the early 20th century, some of you may know this history, Montrose became a school for, how should we say it, girls that had problems. There's all sorts of different terms from that era. What's the most common one, Mary, that we saw for Montrose? Do you remember?
Well, some of them were home for the friendless, but that's pretty sad.
Yeah.
Industrial school is another term for girls that had gotten into trouble and needed to learn some skills.
Right. Well, thanks. Well, anyway, so it was that for many, many years. It actually figures in one of John Waters' works, slightly in a very funny sort of way. But one of his characters had to go there. But it also became a school. Boys were admitted there after a time and were sent there as well. So it was a state institution, and all kinds of large buildings were built, really nice buildings. And it was in that use until it became what it is today, which is Camp Frederick, which is a state guard camp. They do maintain the chapel. I've been there to the outside, not been inside, but it's not too hard to get on to go see it if you say you want to go see it. So anyway, but it was not just Montrose that involved the rectors of the parish. They were very involved in all the churches in the area, and especially with the African American churches. Piney Grove Road, there's a Baptist meeting house. There's the Methodist meeting house at Dover, which was white and black at different points of its history. And various rectors here did services there, did funerals there, and there was a great deal of mixing with all the other faith groups here in the Worthington Valley. Well, a very effective priest comes in 1857. I want to thank Holly Bricken, who got me in touch with the members of the Ridge family who gave me this marvelous photographic image of the Reverend Arthur Ridge, who had a fascinating career, but was mostly associated with being a chaplain and then headmaster of Hannamore Academy at Reisterstown. And with the building of their chapel there, which became an independent parish church, St. Francis, but Arthur John Ridge played a big role here at St. John's. He was full-blown rector from 1857 to 1861. He was convinced by the vestry here to to actually move his family into the rectory here. And they were here till 1861, and then there was a decision made to build a new rectory at Hannah Academy, which I'll talk about in a minute. So he did move his family here, but because he was such an important figure in the Maryland church, he was frequently called upon by the vestry of St. John's, and they would go back, and he came back twice as an interim rector in his very long lifetime. One of the things that we found was brand new in the research, although it had been printed many years ago, but it has never been repeated again, is that one of Arthur John Rich's assisting rectors, was a man named Charles Grafton. And he's actually recognized as, you could say, a saint, or as a holy man of the Episcopal Church. He founded 2 holy orders, one for men and one for women. He is also, he's very much associated with Anglo-Catholicism, and he became Bishop of Fond du Lac in Wisconsin, and I think helped maybe found Nashotah House, or was very much connected to Nashotah House Seminary. And he actually has a feast day in the Episcopal Church, which is on August 30th. In the far left image, I think that is taken about the time that he was assistant rector here, which he was only here a year. And it was during this period, too, that St. John's got its first bell. And we believe it's the same bell that we have today. We have something that we're working on to get it more investigated, but it has always been traditionally was the bell that was saved after the fire, and is the bell today. And cast in the foundry of McShane, which was here in Baltimore until very recently, and they just moved their operations elsewhere. But the chamber organ in the church was the first of the organ in the church, and it was by a firm in Baltimore, Pulpit and Rodewald. And although this isn't it, but it's one that Pulpit and Rodewald made in the style and in the manner we think of the original here. Well, Arthur John Rich moved his family into a new rectory called Ridgely, and it's behind Hannah and I've inserted a photograph that the family sent of the family in front of Ridgely in the 1880s. There's some African American people in the far back, and the tradition is that they may have been formerly enslaved people who stayed on as paid servants after the war. And Ridgely's house still stands. It's, as you see to the right, it's not in great shape, but it's still there. So the Reverend Berger came in 1865, and he was a really selfless, wonderful individual who worked very hard to rebuild the church after the fire, and to work with all sorts of problems here in the neighborhood. I come from, or these days, from Georgia, and have been to this church. This is a church in Clarksville, Georgia, in North Georgia, where he was a rector in the 1830s. Where he began his career, and he was from Pennsylvania. He was actually originally a Calvinist, a German Calvinist, but he left copious notes. He left his own private registry, which the Diocese Archives has, and it records all kinds of things. It records a suicide of a prominent parishioner that we know who was buried in the cemetery, but in an unmarked grave. Member of the Johns family. It records a number of curious events in the history of the parish. But it also deals with, of course, this tragic fire in 1867. And the plaque that commemorates the fire that was inserted into the new church records only 3 people that had to do with the construction. It was the Reverend Berger, Benjamin Worthington, who was the senior warden of the vestry, and also a man named Samuel Starr. And the architect, was a man named Joshua Shore, and he had a cabinet and furniture making establishment over in Westminster, and he was pretty multi-talented and multifaceted in his work. He had a sash and door factory. He did funerals, made coffins. A lot of these fellows did in that period, but he also said he did architectural plans. So he planned several churches in the Westminster area. That sounds a little bogus, but anyway, he did a really beautiful church that was formerly for a Calvinistic congregation. Today I can't remember. It's still there in Westminster, and it's been altered a lot. But his original design for it is there on the left, and if you could see it a little bit better, you'd see it's very much like St. John's. It's very much the same Gothic revival method. So St. John's is completed in 1871 on the left, and a photograph, an older photograph that depicts it in the late 19th century. Of course, certain alterations were made, and so the church is finished. They didn't quite have enough money, and also there was a lien put on the church and was almost foreclosed in the 1870s, and there's differing opinions about it, but it was saved maybe at the last minute from foreclosure by some hasty fundraising to raise $293 to pay off the lien of the remaining amount due to Mr. Shore. And somebody tried to chop Mr. Shore's name out on the plaque. If you look at it, you can see where somebody was very mad. Well, the interior was very austere, and it was mostly an interior to look Gothic by the use of decorative paint, which was not unusual at the time. In fact, highly trained craftsmen who could practice the art of trompe-l'oeil painting did it. They did the church in Westminster too, which is over there on the left, the upper slide, which is hard to see. But anyway, the original interior of St. John's, as you see on the right. And what we know about the sort of Gothicism of Mr. Shore's design, the doorway, which is now gone, the front doorway, and also these pulpit chairs that we think he made are the sort of remnants of that period. Well, one of the difficult things for St. John's in its late 19th century history was that there was a new parish carved out of Western Run, and there were two different times it was carved up, and really led by Reverend Rich, who really wanted to create a new parish for Reisterstown and for All Saints Church, which was built in the end of the 19th century. But many people still treasured St. John's. Bishop Pinckney, who came and said, confirmed, and he said, there is no reason why this beautiful church should not stand out in all its beauty. It has ability, and all it lacks is concert. On a way to put it, maybe that people needed to cooperate a little bit. So anyway, St. John's next rector was really classed a missionary because the church didn't have enough people to constitute a vestry after the 1890s. In fact, tragically, it had a lot of women, but women weren't allowed to vote for the vestry. So therefore, the church had to have a missionary. So the Reverend Reginald Heber Murphy, who came briefly in 1877, but came back for 12 years in 1899. And he also presided over a chapel that's sort of near Glendon. It's not there anymore, St. Luke's, which you see in this photograph. And so he sadly died. He had it said he died from overwork and on the job here, and he died in a church home, and from a heart attack, in the aftermath of a heart attack. And after his death, St. John's did get a deacon who then became a rector, and his name was Mr. Jung, J-U-N-G, of German descent. And it was the first time I think we've ever had the wedding of a rector in the church. He married a local young lady, and the Bishop Murray, presided over his wedding. This is Bishop Murray's notes on that. Well, after Mr. Young, the next rector was actually the rector of Reisterstown, and we were folded, St. John's was folded in under Reisterstown Parish. And he was this bright young fellow, Thomas Knott Barth, fresh out of seminary. He was a native Marylander. He ended up being the Bishop of Tennessee, and it's kind of well known in the Episcopal Church because of his years as Bishop in Tennessee. But this church, he took over in the very late teens and early 20s, I mean. And he may have had something to do with the rejuvenation of the church. We're not entirely certain. But the valley was changing rapidly with the movement, as I mentioned earlier, the Green Spring kennels, with various farms being bought. Alfred Gwynn Vanderbilt's mother gave him, a farm where he did some horse racing for a time. So the development of racing, this is a photograph of people at the races in the 1930s, brought a whole new attention to the valley, and as did the various hunts, the Thanksgiving Day hunt. This is from the early 1930s. And of course, the tradition began at some point of the annual hunt, having a service here first, blessing of the hounds, etc. And we just can't be absolutely certain what date that starts. It's been written as being 1925. I think Holly, you all might still be looking for this in your records, but it's or if Mike's here, he was working for it as well. I think it's about it's certainly 1929 or 30, as far as we can tell, because the first mention in the church vestry minutes is 1930 of inviting those participating in the hunt to church. So that's then the beginning of the work of a new vestry that occurred in 1927. There had been no vestry until 27. It may have been the Bishop of Maryland, but it might have also been Barth, who went around to various property owners and found some Episcopalians who moved into the valley and got them interested. And so a new vestry was appointed, or came together, I should say, and elected officers and reorganized the church in 1927. And key among the new vestry was C. Wilbur Miller, and he came to that first meeting with his wife, Edith, and they were very interested in the beautification of the church. And it was said from the beginning that Mr. Miller hoped to donate a redecoration of the church and a new organ, and that indeed was what happened. So what's really nice, we came up with some images from the Maryland Historical Society, Center for Maryland History, that were glass plates of the church just not long after the renovations were finished. And Ben Buchanan did a great job of pairing those with today. So these are the 1930s photos on the left and today. There. It's a great view. And this wonderful view of the rectory with the riders of the hunt riding past the gates and the carriage block, as well as the portico. And Mr. and Mrs. Miller had a estate right near the intersection of, as many of you know, the intersection of Falls Road and Shawan. And it was an outstanding house that had been designed by a favorite architect of theirs, Mr. Edmonds. And Mr. Edmonds became the architect for the church redecoration. And I want to thank Tom Webby, who's here, who's a grandson of Mr. Miller, and who lent me these beautiful hand-tinted images of Pleasant Hill. They're in an album on the right, and on the left is the surviving gatehouse of Pleasant Hill, which is all that is left of that magnificent estate. And here's the Thanksgiving Day view from either 1931 or 32. We know because Mr. Flockhart, who was by then the rector, his name appears on the sign to the right of the lich gate. And the lich gate is a marvelous feature that we can't find plans or designs for, but we believe, and we know from photographic evidence, appears sometime between 1929 and 1932, and very much in an English parish church tradition. And here's the Reverend Dr. Flockhart, who arrives in the late 1920s, standing next to what seems to be the new lich gate. So this is just a quick showing of what you may know well, but you may have missed about the incredible work that was done on the church in 1927, 28, and 29 through the planning of Mr. Edmonds, the gift of Mr. and Mrs. Miller, and this carving, as well as the stained glass. And the stained glass is the work of the studio of Charles Connick in Boston, who was a favored stained glass guy, some of the leading Gothic Revival architects in America at the time, and whose stained glass was considered a very sort of perfect replication of the medieval tradition of stained glass, as well as his use of certain colored glass that was very ubiquitous. And so these side windows that depict passages from St. John's Gospel, and as well as the chancel window, and this very interesting window that's actually taken from Revelation, which is here. And different parishioners were asked to donate for individual windows, and some did. And so the windows are marked accordingly to who gave them. A man named Evelyn Harrison gave this window. He was one of the new vestry in memory of his parents. And so one of the nice things that the church has are copies of the original drawings, but they only came to the church 4 years ago. John Schilling tells a story about them being dropped off. It was not really known who dropped them off, but through Holly Brigham, we kind of saw this as Mr. Hyde was a partner in the firm of Edmonds. It was Edmonds and Hyde after the 1930s, and his son Jonathan Hyde gave these drawings, or these copies drawings, to the church. And they laid out very neatly how the chancel was to be reorganized with new carving, with symbols, various Christian symbols carved, as well as for everything from the lectern to the little marquee that shows hymns for the day. All that was designed specifically for the new church interior, as well as the pulpit, and just about everything inside. They really stripped out all the 19th century tomfoolery work that really wasn't the greatest and of that period, and put in this very fine new carving. So if you've never really looked at this carving, and I want to thank Ben for taking these marvelous photographs of it, you really should. And it's a real test in Christian symbolism. Is that right, Thomas? Should we say that? Thomas was stumped a few times. I think everyone has been. And Tracy knows this carving quite well. But it's just amazing what it depicts. But these are all symbols of the apostles. And I won't go through those. But anyway, I have a little chart if anybody wants to carry it over. And you can learn your apostle symbolism. But what's remarkable, too, is how the wainscoting carving was matched with other carving. Some of the above chancel carving, there's a banding above it with different flowers and leaves. And these are the lilies. And this is the drawing. And then you can see some of this carving above the wainscot, as well as the individual carvings. And all these have meanings. And the drawings, the very first of these drawings, actually set out what should be depicted on the symbols on the wainscot. And what we don't know is who decided that. We don't know if Edmonds, the architect, decided it. We wondered about Mr. Miller. we've asked Mrs. Fenwick and Mr. Webby, his descendants, but we really don't know who decided. It may have been Mr. Barth, who was the rector at the time. But anyway, amazing symbolism, lots of them in the carvings on the landscape. And the table for the elements, with the chalice and with the pelican carrying out her heart as a symbol, which is an important Anglican symbol. There were actually plans that were never taken to fruition. There was a plan to maybe do a half reredos behind the altar, which was not done. But there were carvings that are everywhere for example, the pulpit furniture. This is the eagle for the lectern, as you see. And then carvings that were by a German carver who came over to work for the firm. And these had ended up at the Baltimore Architectural Collection at the University of Baltimore. These images, and then the carvings themselves for the four Gospels. Gospelers, I should say. And all these other elements. There was noted in the minutes that that the floor plaque, the floor monument to Mrs. Miller was voted by the vestry in the 1930s after her death. And also the organ was donated at the time. It's not the organ today. It was taken out in the 1990s for the new organ. But it was a great, at the time when it was installed in 1928, it was a great progression for the church and its music program, which in that period had 4 hired voices and the same 4 parts as today, and may have even had it before that in that patterning, but was doing a very high level of church music. There was a singer named Mr. Chalmers that everybody was so thrilled about. And it was always, Mr. Chalmers will sing this, and he was a baritone. He was probably a very, you're laughing, because baritones can sometimes be loud, and he was probably loud. But anyway, Mr. Chalmers, who sang in opera in Baltimore and elsewhere, he was given control of the choir because he was not given solos, and he decided he was going to quit. And so the vestry voted to give him control of the choir. And oddly, the church organist didn't like that. She as the organist, she quit the next Sunday when Mr. Chalmers got control of everything. But anyway, there's lots of this little gossipy stuff in the minutes. Well, Mr. Miller gave a beautiful set of windows in the 1940s, also by Connick. They were in the tower, that were the last of the windows for the new church, that are all music related. Well, the rectors after 1935, William Page Dane in the center, and then those who followed him. And as I mentioned earlier, death of Dr. Dane was a real hit for the parish because he was very popular, even though he had only been here for a few years. But he had had a long career and was very beloved, and his loss was keenly felt. The other rectors to the left, David Trimble and Robert Kell, did not stay for long periods of time. Calvert Buck, who you see on the right, was maybe a little bit more of the Anglo-Catholic bent, and he came and had a very successful time. And all of those rectors were working with outreach at Montrose. They were all working with the treatment center for the insane at Rosewood. They would have services there every week. They were baptizing inmates in those places, as well as doing funerals. And it's a whole other part of this outreach story of St. John's. Well, St. John's was working towards a new parish hall. The design for it on the left was not what was followed. It ended up with a little building on the right because of funding at that point. Here it is with the keys being turned over in 1955. Mr. Miller passed away in 1955, and I think very aptly his family used this verse, and he built there an altar unto the Lord and for his work on the church. Well, that's just been a little pathway into this twisted history, not twisted, but I should say twisted path of history at St. John's, and I hope you learned some new things from it. I've certainly learned a lot being here, and thank you for listening.
So we have some refreshments, but some of you, and I'm sure you might want to come and speak with Jonathan about any of this. This is just a small amount that he's shown you of a great deal of really wonderful work, and we're about to have an offering or two. Would you entertain a few questions?
Absolutely. Yes?
Can you tell us about the wall? Does the wall, was it built at the same time as the first church?
Yes, I'm sorry. It was given at the same time by John Douglas.
It was.
There had been an earlier, there was some sort of wall earlier, a smaller enclosure, and there was a paling fence that was put up around the churchyard at the very beginning. And John Johns had chaired the committee to build that. And that's in 1819 or 1820.
A paling fence?
That means just wood, a wood fence. Pales. Yeah. Sorry, there's somebody back there. Yes?
Could you say a little bit more about the church during the Civil War period, and what we know about the church then?
Well, what is really, really curious, there's almost nothing. The vestry minutes just pretty much stopped during that period. There was a member, a younger brother of the Reverend Rich, who was appointed by the bishop, who was a deacon, and he came to be the lay reader, and he seems to have read services during 1862, and then after that, we don't know that that continued, and it wasn't until the Reverend Berger arrived in 1865, and one of the first acts when he arrived was to do the funeral of a Confederate soldier who was from one of the Cockey family, and the Cockeys, that there was one branch of the Cockey family very involved with St. John's, and he was buried at the Cockey family cemetery by the rector of St. John's. But that's really all we know about the Civil War. Yes?
Do we know anything about how the fire started? Was it 1860s?
Yes, we do. It's pretty over and over said. It sounds like, oh, it's Christmas Eve, it was a Christmas candle, but it was actually a defective flue, is the way they put it. And the church had coal-burning stoves in this period going on. Yes?
The Reverend William Rich, who was associate here in the 80s, he was descended from that. Was he descended from that rector Rich?
Yes, he was. In fact, I got to do an interview with him by phone. So, yes, Jim, thank you. Yes.
The damage to the chapel on the entrance to St. John's, could you go over that again while we see that damage to the plaque?
I'm sorry, I missed the first one.
The
damage on the plaque?
Yeah.
Well, somebody else told me that they thought this, but I don't know this for sure, but it's the only damage on the plaque, and it's over Shorb and Lester Architects. And Mr. Shorb sued the church for unpaid bills, and it almost went to foreclosure. St. John's had a really long-suffering rector in 1879 to 1890, the Reverend Tennant, and he got here and the church was about to be foreclosed upon, and he was terrified, and he went to the bishop, and the bishop said, sorry, can't help you, and he went to all the other local priests, and they said, sorry, can't help you, and he finally convinced, again, one of the ladies of the Worthington family to give a little, and also Benjamin Worthington, who lived at Goshen, which I got to see through his owner, Freddie, who's here. Freddie, sorry. No, it was not. It was amazing that happened just as he arrived, and the only thing we can think is that there was some animosity about Mr. Shore, but Mr. Shore died like within a couple of years of that. He did not live a long life yet. So anyway, and none of his plans survived, and we don't really know a lot about it. So that's it.
In churches, I've often seen the nose has been knocked off a particular statue. And I've often thought, well, why did that happen? Was it a mark of disrespect? Somebody would take the nose off the statue. I'm sure you've seen a number of them yourself.
Yeah, I can't really. I mean, I guess it's a situation as old as time, and that sort of thing happens. But that's the only thing here that's like that. It's not seemed to happen much in the cemetery or anywhere else like you see often other places. But that's the one thing. And I don't know if that's really the case. Maybe it's just a coincidence. But someone else might have that story.
John, I've heard bits and pieces about investigations being done into the churchyard and seminary. You mentioned one unmarked grave. With that one exception, is there reason to believe that everyone else has been accounted for?
What was the last part of that question, Mike? Sorry.
With that one exception, you mentioned one unmarked grave during your talk today. With that
Right.
exception?
No, there's more than one. I'm sorry, I may have misstated. But there's one that we know now who it is from the register, and it's the only example we know of an African-American person being buried in the cemetery, and it was this an enslaved child that belonged to one of the families out there, and he was, and there is indeed a space in the row of that family. So, yeah.
Okay, well, Jared and Thomas, I think are...
Oh, let me just say one more thing,
Okay.
Tracy. A number of you here today were so helpful to me, and I want to thank you. I really appreciate all your help, Freddie. Thank you for having me. And Jim, thank you for coming to talk to me about music. And I'm afraid I'm going to miss somebody, but thank you all for all your help with this project. It's been spectacular.
Are you going to write about them? You've got some great stories. Are you going to write about them?
Yes, there's going to be a report.
Is there some way we can find out what all the wood carvings mean? Is there any kind of...
Well, we're also writing a tour of the church. Is that what you...
Well, each one of the emblems and things that you just
Right.
you said there, the apostles and...
Right, and all these other symbols in the wainscot.
And it's embarrassing, but we don't really know what they are. We're doing our research now, too. So, because there are a lot of them.
Yeah. So, beautiful.
I was just going to say, I'm Jeanette, and I was the organist here for the years. This picture here shows the part of the new organ. When one of the designs that they made would have covered up part of that stained glass window. And I said, no, that's not going to work. And so we redesigned it.
Splendid.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, everyone.